Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've had the highest inflation in over 3 decades. The Consumers Price Index coming in at 5.9%, annual increase for the year, for the quarter ending December 2021. I mean, we've got some pretty astounding numbers coming through in the COVID era, but to see inflation, just below that symbolic 6%, given that the Reserve Bank's target is, of course, a midpoint of 2% with a upper band of 3%, things are really rocking when it comes to prices. And you've had a look at the numbers. What stood out for you?
A couple of areas were some of the key ones. We had residential building costs. They're up 16% from a year ago, and for the third quarter in a row, risen by about 4.5%. If they keep going at that rate, we'll be up to 21, 22% next quarter. So that's a massive rate of increase there, and just shows you how stretched the residential construction industry is, and as well some of those materials prices coming through, pushing up costs there as well. You also had transport costs rising. A couple of key components in there. Vehicle costs, particularly for used cars, are up, I think, about 12% on where they were this time last year. Airfares are well up, although, of course, most of us aren't flying around too much anyway at the moment, so we're not too bothered about that. But probably more importantly, if we're not flying, we are driving, and petrol prices up to record highs and up about 30% on where they were this time last year as well. And that is really putting a squeeze on household budgets alongside some of the other cost increases. So there's some highlights there, but also quite broad-based inflation. And I think one of the other key numbers for me was just the strength of non-tradable inflation. That's the stuff that we don't export or import. It's what's produced here, and it just shows us the amount of price pressures there are in the domestic economy. That is also running at a 30-year high of 5.3%. So, when people tell you it's all about supply chains and disruption and international shipping costs, it's not. There's a whole lot of stresses within the domestic economy as well.
Well, and that's one of the major points, right? Like looking below or beneath those headline numbers, your tradables inflation at 6.9%, that's the sort of stuff that New Zealand doesn't have too much of an ability to influence. It is those global pressures. But I think what's interesting, even with those tradable inflation numbers, is that, look, yes, they're high, and yes, part of that is fuel and what have you, but it does reinforce that view that you are having global inflation continuing to rise at a faster clip than we've seen previously. So, even if it is imported, it's something we've got to keep an eye on, and it's an issue for the rest of the world. But that non-tradables at 5.3%, a lot of that, like you've highlighted, is domestic focused. I mean, essentially, right, we've got the New Zealand economy saying, look, everyone wants a lot of goods and services. Demand for stuff is high, but the supply able to meet that request for demand just simply isn't there to the same degree. And so what you're seeing is, look, you and I are in a shop, there's one thing left because there's not a lot, and we're both demanding it. The supply hasn't come through. If I want to walk away from that shop with the good in hand, I'm going to pay more for it than you to make sure I've got it. But also we know that, businesses are having to be quite careful with what's coming in. They're seeing cost increases themselves and therefore having to look at passing them on. So, I mean, that divide between the tradables and non-tradables are important, as well as those other numbers across the board. I mean, where do we go from here? What's the point of this? I see some people throwing out ideas of, do we slash GST and similar? Do we provide, all sorts of different support? I mean, there are two big decision makers here. There's the government through Finance Minister Grant Robertson, and there's Adrian Orr, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, who'll have to talk to his Monetary Policy Committee at some point soon. I mean, what do they need to do?
Well, I think we have poured a lot of fuel on the fire in terms of stimulating the economy over the last 2 years, and so from the government's point of view, less fiscal stimulus because the economy is holding together well. And indeed, we have seen comments from Grant Robertson over the last few weeks that there isn't so much money left in the kitty now, and there is not going to be as much government support for the economy going forward. So there are signs of that sort of approach is just starting to change a little bit. But more importantly for me is what the Reserve Bank does from here. Last year, they were pretty cautious in terms of their approach to monetary conditions and lifting interest rates, worried about, further outbreaks of COVID within New Zealand. Now we've had those. We've currently, got Omicron coming into the community. But the economy, generally speaking, and those demand conditions have held up really strongly. And so from here now, I mean, the Reserve Bank is facing strong domestic price pressures, and I think there's a lot more to come there, because what we haven't seen yet is wage inflation accelerating a great deal. The unemployment rate's at 3.4%. We could well see a lower number than that with the next release next week. There is going to be more wage pressure coming through, and inflation expectations have risen, cost expectations have risen, and businesses will pass those costs on because they know that everyone else, their competitors, everyone else around the economy is also going to be passing those costs on. It's an incredibly different situation to the price discipline that we have had through most of the last 3 decades, where increasingly businesses have become scared to put up their prices in case they lost market share. That's not the case now because they're struggling to meet the demand anyway. So they're going to pass on the cost increases that are being faced. So the labour market is really key for me here, because I think there will be more coming through. And so from the Reserve Bank's point of view, there's no choice for them but to raise interest rates. And really, to me, it looks like 50 basis points has to be on the cards in February.
Absolutely. No, look, I think it's important to remember that for the last decade or so, we've existed with incredibly low and stable inflation. In fact, probably lower than the Reserve Bank would have wanted to see it. And so now that we're on the upside, it's something that New Zealand just hasn't really experienced in a long time. And the difficulty I can foresee is that, you know, these, what economists talk about, the sort of uncoupling of expectations around inflation, means that if people are sitting there, if businesses are sitting there thinking, gosh, prices are going to go higher in the future, maybe I'm not quite sure how I'm going to plan or if I'm going to invest or how that's going to play out. And importantly, I need to put up my prices ahead of time to make sure that I don't get caught myself with higher costs. All of that is going to contribute to more and more inflation. And the worry there is that, you know, you don't get that price stability that people do want to plan their business, their household life, everything else. And so I think the Reserve Bank has got a big risk there. Whereas last year, you know, they took a very cautious approach. They were worried about the possible, and that was the thing, possible implications of further COVID outbreaks. They ignored, in my mind, what was there quite clearly in front of them, that inflation is running hot. It's not expected to go hot. It is already here. You know, it's nearly triple their midpoint. They are going to have to address it. I completely agree with you in terms of a 50 basis point increase, but I still don't expect, in a sense, the Reserve Bank will. They've shown themselves so far to want to continue with that cautious approach. My worry is that they get to the point where the market forces their hand, that the Reserve Bank is too far behind the 8 ball and moving too slowly, and therefore has to make much more drastic changes to monetary policy over a much shorter period of time. I think we're going to continue to see inflation be quite hot over this year and into next year as well. 2023 is not going to be, a particularly cheap year, and that is the sort of thing that policymakers are going to have to watch very carefully. And I think that we'll continue to watch those numbers. We'll assess where they go. Probably more importantly, what decision makers do with all of this and more on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.